So Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso inventing Cubism around 1910, co-inventing it in collaboration, is to the art world as quantum physics and the theory of relativity were to the study of physics, in that it's an entirely new way of understanding how things work. Or we could compare it perhaps to the invention of the airplane in terms of an entirely new relationship to space and time, where people are going to feel as if they don't see things in the same way anymore. In fact, Picasso and Braque jokingly referred to each other as the Wright brothers. They thought of themselves as being pioneers of flight, only this was a conceptual flight. And what they do with these strange paintings full of facets, a monochromatic brown, light golden brown, grayish black palette, their strange use of facets and compressed forms, all of this is going to radiate outward and change many other artists' practice as well. So we need to think carefully about this art, and I want to kind of work with you on that by kind of walking through what the textbook does to explain it, giving the title Analytic Cubism, and they begin here by giving you an origin point and linking it to the 1906 Cézanne retrospective Demoiselles d'Avignon, as well as work that Braque was showing. So Braque in 1908 is showing work like this, a painting like this, that's a direct response to Cézanne, a landscape painting that's actually looking at the same site, La Staque. And what Braque is doing is reducing all of the details, abstracting the forms into very clear geometric planes, suggestive of cubes, all the forms reduced in this way so that we have the interplay of line against line, plane against plane, which is what he is studying from Cézanne, and what will give the work that he develops with Picasso the name Cubism, these little cubes. And that's what the textbook is talking about here, where that work was rejected and criticized. What it evolves into is something more complex. Here, the textbook talks about the painting in 1909, Violin and Palette, to introduce where Picasso and Braque go. So like Cézanne, Picasso and Braque will use still life as their realm of exploration, partly because still life is simple. It's an arrangement of objects rather controlled, and then like a scientist, you can play with the variables. So the still life here, the textbook says, is the still life items are not arranged in a measured progression from foreground to background depth, but push close to the picture plane, the surface, the plane of the surface, confined to a shallow space. And they talk about a shifting surface of forms and colors. So I want to actually juxtapose that with those words in your mind to a photograph of an actual relief sculpture. So they talked about relief. That's a way of comparing the kind of space that is constructed in this painting to relief sculpture, where you have a panel from which forms project out. Because there is a sense of the violin's curved form projecting out, pushing toward us, even as there is, yes, a pulling back. The push and the pull that we talked about with Cézanne. I'm showing you the Donatello because I'm playing a little ironic joke here. This photograph is showing how Donatello in 1425 was giving his relief sculpture both its projection forward and a new illusionistic space back, because he was using the system of one-point linear perspective that his friend Brunelleschi had invented. This was a way of creating a sense of convincing space through the use of a unifying point for all the angles of the orthogonal lines that allow the construction of a profound illusion. Notice that that is being completely undone by Braque. There is no sense of a unified space back. There are compartments and facets, compressions and projections. One way of understanding this is that this art is not just about the visual experience of space, but the tactile experience of space. The authors go on to talk about the portrait of Kahnweiler here on 32.8, as well as the portrait titled Majoli that's on the introductory page, figure 32.1, to show us portraits and also to get us thinking about what is the relationship between the style of Cubism as these series of fractures and whatever is represented. So they propose here that analytic Cubism begins to resemble the actual process of perception, during which we examine objects from various points of view and reassemble our glances into a whole object in our brain. I'm not sure that I entirely agree with that, because I think it's not that helpful to think of this, their goal as being to create a kind of resemblance to how things actually work. I think it's more helpful to think of them as playing games with perception. So play is a very sophisticated form of exploration and experimentation. Play is a way of making things strange purposefully. And so we have a play with the structure of drawing, where we get a scaffolding of form and space, but it does not cohere into a solid unity. It becomes kind of a game of forward and backward in a kind of space that is sometimes three-dimensional, sometimes two-dimensional, sometimes maybe fourth-dimensional, involving the element of time. And then we get the techniques of illusion, which are the layering of light and shadow, right? So we see these kind of light strokes merging into the shadow strokes, as if kind of the traditional academic skill of modeling form, but the illusion is actually broken down and it becomes this kind of glowing veil of light that's all around. And this is very important, there is no clear separation between figure and ground. One of the most fundamental kind of habits of art in the West, all through its history, had been that you have a figure against a ground. That's the distinction operating as an assumption for artists like Cézanne in the 1860s, where you have the form of a figure, here's his portrait, against a ground that is understood to be background, neutral, empty space, solid void. That completely breaks down here, where you have no clear separation. What is solid? What is void? What is figure? What is ground? So you have this moment of feeling like you have a kind of a solid line against the light, the sleeve, and yet the fingers are just these simple strokes, cartoon-like. That is one of the signs that Picasso and Braque are starting to play a little bit. They're playing at being the Wright brothers of painting, and they're playing a little with different kinds of sign systems, different forms of representation. The old forms of modeling in academic art, but also new forms of cartoons. Look at the hair, like a cartoon character's waves. Even the suit coat has a little bit of a cartoon character quality. They're starting to get interested in mass culture as well. So one of the things they're doing is they're giving us a game that plays with perception and representation. We see signs that refer to things sometimes, but sometimes they seem to be just abstract marks and signs for themselves. And we observe ourselves observing as we struggle to decode what we're seeing. And then the game of Cubism evolves, new twists, playing now with new kinds of materials that add new elements of complex, conflicting representation. So here we have not a painting anymore. Now we have a collage of printed material, basically junk from the real world. We have newspaper strips, alcohol bottle labels, we have wallpaper. And so now there's this play with mass culture and fine art, the machine produced and the handmade, the cheap, vulgar, commonplace versus sophisticated artistry, drawing to form the illusion of a glass, but the drawing is so basic. It's just a stroke here, a stroke there, as if to show the game of illusionism. Look, we put the little dark lines there and you believe this to be round, but it's flat because it's on newspaper. Yet the newspaper lines of text reinforce flatness, and yet strangely and humorously, they also resemble modeling, cross-hatching to create a sense of shadowing and shading. So, and then there's this flat pattern of wallpaper art. Talk about, mass-produced art, commercial, everyday elements. And then you have, this high art form, the still life, that's got this academic pedigree, but it's associated with cafe culture. However, this is not a picture of a cafe. It is not a depiction of a cafe still life. It is a construction of actual cafe stuff. So one of the jokes here is this is a more real than realism. I don't know if that sentence made sense. I'm playing with language. I guess I'm inspired by their plays with different sign systems. In other words, it's a real label from the cafe that you would drink, not just a picture of the bottle, the actual bottle. So the play of sign systems means we've got all sorts of different kinds of visual representation. We've got the stamped, mechanically reproduced flowers. We've got cutout forms. We've got drawing with some traditional elements for modeling form in space. We've got some suggestions of space in the way paint is applied, and then we have these cut forms that suggest a round cafe table, cut strips from the newspaper, and actual words, word and image combined, different kinds of image making. It's a shifting game of different kind of codes. We read images and we read words. And this artwork has famously been analyzed for the fact that you can read the words and that they deal with the outbreak of violence and war in the Balkans, 1914. This is a harbinger of the fact that World War I is on its way, and people in Paris are reading about the first skirmishes of that battle while drinking their aperitif.